The most frightening thing about a narcissist is not that they can destroy you. It is that they can destroy something beautiful and then convince themselves that they were the victim. They can lose a loving partner, damage a family, sabotage friendships, ruin opportunities, and still walk away believing everyone else was the problem. But why? Because sometimes destruction is not about hatred. It is about protecting a wounded self from feelings that seem impossible to survive. And once you understand that, their behavior begins to make a disturbing kind of sense. Have you ever watched someone push away the very person who loved them most? You gave patience, you gave understanding, you tried to communicate, you offered another chance. And somehow, the closer you became, the more they created chaos. That contradiction is the key, because a person can desperately want connection and simultaneously be terrified of what genuine connection demands from them. If you've ever experienced this, stay with me, because what looks like cruelty on the surface may have a much deeper psychological mechanism underneath it. And before we go further, if you've ever wondered why someone destroys what they once claimed to love, stay until the end. The answer may change the way you interpret their behavior, and more importantly, the way you interpret yourself. What often appears as a narcissist destroying relationships, opportunities, or peaceful environments can be understood through a deeper psychological mechanism. They may feel threatened by anything that exposes the vulnerable parts of themselves they have spent years trying to hide. Genuine intimacy does exactly that. When someone gets close, they begin to see beyond the image. They notice insecurity behind confidence, fear behind anger, loneliness behind arrogance, and shame behind the constant need to appear superior. For someone who depends heavily on a protected self-image, being truly seen can feel less like love and more like danger. This is why closeness can create a strange contradiction. At first, they may desperately seek someone who admires them, understands them, and makes them feel important. But once that person becomes emotionally close enough to recognize inconsistencies, the relationship can become threatening. The partner may say, "That hurt me," or establish a boundary, or simply stop providing constant validation. Instead of experiencing these moments as normal parts of intimacy, the narcissistic pattern may interpret them as humiliation, rejection, or exposure. The psychological response can then become defensive. Rather than asking, "Why did that affect me so strongly?" they may attack the person who triggered the feeling. Criticism becomes an accusation, a boundary becomes disrespect, independence becomes abandonment, disagreement becomes betrayal. The person who once represented safety suddenly becomes the enemy because their presence has activated something painful internally. This is where destruction can begin. Devaluing the other person can temporarily restore a sense of superiority. Creating conflict can shift attention away from inner insecurity. Ending the relationship first can create the illusion of control over the possibility of being rejected. In this sense, destruction may function as emotional self-protection. But understanding this mechanism should never become an excuse for harmful behavior. A painful history can explain why someone developed defensive patterns, but it does not give them permission to manipulate, abuse, humiliate, or repeatedly harm others. The deeper tragedy is that the very defenses designed to protect them from emotional pain can ultimately destroy the connection they desperately wanted. Control can become more important than connection when a person experiences emotional closeness as a threat to their sense of safety. Healthy connection requires two people to remain separate individuals. You have your opinions, needs, boundaries, emotions, friendships, and choices, while the other person has theirs. There is room for disagreement without the relationship becoming a battlefield. But in a narcissistic pattern, another person's independence can sometimes be experienced as a loss of control, and loss of control can awaken intense feelings of insecurity, rejection, or inadequacy. This is why control may gradually replace genuine intimacy. Instead of asking, "How can we understand each other?" the unconscious question becomes, "How can I make sure this person behaves in a way that keeps me emotionally comfortable?" The partner may be expected to respond immediately, agree frequently, provide constant reassurance, avoid criticism, or organize their behavior around the narcissist's emotional state. What looks like a simple request can gradually become an expectation of obedience. When the other person resists, the response may become disproportionate. A normal boundary can be interpreted as disrespect. A different opinion can be treated as betrayal. Time spent with friends can become evidence of disloyalty. Independence can be portrayed as selfishness. The objective is no longer mutual understanding. It becomes restoring psychological control. Control can take many forms. It may appear as criticism, guilt, silent treatment, emotional withdrawal, jealousy, intimidation, excessive monitoring, or repeatedly creating conflict until the other person gives in. Sometimes it is subtle enough that the victim begins questioning their own judgment. They start thinking, maybe I am being difficult, maybe I should just avoid this argument. Slowly, their world becomes smaller. The tragedy is that control can produce the exact outcome the person fears. When someone feels controlled, they eventually become emotionally distant, guarded, resentful, or desperate to escape. The narcissistic person then interprets that distance as proof that people cannot be trusted, reinforcing the original fear. Real connection requires the ability to tolerate another person's freedom. Love cannot survive where one person's emotional safety depends on controlling the other person's choices. Understanding this pattern helps reveal that domination may look powerful on the outside while being driven by profound insecurity underneath. A person with strong narcissistic defenses may struggle to sit with painful emotions such as shame, insecurity, fear, jealousy, or inadequacy. Instead of recognizing these feelings as internal experiences, they may unconsciously push them outward and locate their source in another person. This process can make someone else responsible for emotions they do not want to acknowledge within themselves. The result is often a relationship where one person is repeatedly blamed for feelings that actually originated somewhere much deeper. Imagine someone who feels insecure but cannot tolerate the thought, "I am afraid that I am not enough." That admission requires vulnerability. Instead, the feeling may be transformed into an accusation. "You are trying to make me feel inadequate." Someone experiencing shame may not think, "I made a mistake." They may respond by attacking the other person's character, making the other person feel defective instead. The painful emotion has been transferred outward, where it feels easier to manage. This can create a confusing dynamic for the person on the receiving end. You may be accused of being selfish when you were simply expressing a need. You may be called disrespectful because you established a boundary. You may be accused of being unfaithful because the other person feels insecure. You may even find yourself constantly defending your intentions while the original issue disappears beneath accusations and arguments. The psychological function of this behavior is important to understand. If the person can convince themselves that you are the problem, they temporarily do not have to confront what is happening inside them. Blame becomes a shield against self-awareness. Anger can cover fear, arrogance can cover shame, accusations can cover vulnerability. But projection does not resolve the underlying emotion, it only relocates it. The insecurity remains, waiting for another situation to activate it again. Eventually, the same pattern can appear with another partner, another friend, or another family member. Understanding projection does not mean accepting mistreatment. Someone's unresolved insecurity may explain why they repeatedly blame others, but it does not make those accusations true. The healthier response is to recognize what belongs to you and what does not. You can take responsibility for your actual mistakes without accepting responsibility for emotions that another person refuses to examine within themselves. Vulnerability can feel like weakness to someone who has learned that emotional exposure is dangerous. In a healthy relationship, saying "I am hurt, I am afraid," or "I need reassurance" can create closeness because it allows another person to understand what is happening beneath the surface. But when a person has built a strong defensive identity around appearing powerful, independent, superior, or unaffected, admitting emotional needs can feel humiliating. Instead of experiencing vulnerability as a normal part of being human, they may experience it as surrendering power. This can explain why someone may become uncomfortable when a relationship becomes emotionally intimate. At first, they may enjoy attention, admiration, affection, and excitement. These experiences make them feel valued without necessarily requiring deep emotional exposure. But genuine intimacy eventually asks for something different. It asks them to reveal uncertainty, acknowledge mistakes, listen to another person's pain, and accept that they cannot control everything. That is where their defenses may become activated. Instead of saying, "I am scared that you might leave me," they may become angry when you spend time away from them. Instead of admitting, "Your criticism hurt my confidence," they may attack your intelligence or character. Instead of saying, "I feel insecure," they may accuse you of trying to undermine them. The vulnerable feeling is hidden beneath a stronger emotion because anger, contempt, or superiority can feel safer than fear. This pattern can become destructive because emotional openness is necessary for repair. Every relationship experiences misunderstandings, disappointment, and conflict. If someone cannot tolerate vulnerability, they may respond to these moments by withdrawing, blaming, attacking, or pretending they do not care. The relationship loses the ability to heal because the emotional truth cannot safely enter the conversation. Eventually, the other person may begin walking on eggshells, carefully choosing words to avoid triggering another defensive reaction. They may stop expressing needs, suppress disagreements, and hide their own emotions. What appears to be peace is actually emotional disconnection. The deeper issue is not that vulnerability is truly weakness. It is that vulnerability may have become associated with danger. Until a person can experience emotional openness without feeling diminished, they may continue protecting themselves from intimacy, and in doing so, repeatedly damage the very relationships that could have offered genuine connection. People often repeat relational patterns, not because they consciously want to suffer, but because the emotional strategies they learned earlier in life can become deeply familiar. A person may grow accustomed to relationships built around instability, competition, emotional distance, or conditional affection. Later, even when healthier possibilities appear, the nervous system may still recognize the old pattern as familiar. Familiarity can be mistaken for safety simply because it is known. In narcissistic patterns, this repetition can become especially destructive because relationships may follow a recognizable emotional sequence. In the beginning, there can be intense admiration, attention, idealization, and emotional closeness. The other person may be treated as exceptionally important because the relationship temporarily supports a desired image of connection and self-worth. Everything feels unusually intense, and the bond may seem almost perfect, but intimacy eventually reveals differences. The other person develops independent needs, expresses disagreement, establishes boundaries, or stops providing constant reassurance. This can activate insecurity. Instead of tolerating the discomfort and communicating openly, the narcissistic pattern may shift toward criticism, suspicion, emotional withdrawal, blame, or devaluation. The person who was once idealized becomes increasingly portrayed as selfish, disloyal, difficult, or inadequate. Eventually, the relationship may reach a breaking point. There may be emotional chaos, separation, or complete withdrawal, yet the ending does not necessarily resolve the underlying psychological conflict. Without genuine self-reflection, the person may enter another relationship and repeat the same sequence with someone new. The important point is that the new partner is not necessarily causing the pattern. The circumstances may simply activate the same unresolved emotional structure. Different person, different environment, different story, but remarkably similar emotional reactions. This repetition can also make the individual believe that everyone eventually disappoints them. Instead of recognizing the pattern as something happening within their own relationships, they may interpret every failed connection as evidence that other people are untrustworthy, selfish, or incapable of love. This protects the self-image because responsibility remains outside. Breaking the cycle requires something much more difficult than finding a better partner. It requires recognizing one's own emotional triggers, tolerating uncomfortable feelings, accepting responsibility, and learning healthier ways of relating. Without that internal work, changing people does not necessarily change the relationship. The same defenses can recreate the same conflict until the person becomes willing to examine the pattern rather than continually blaming the people who encounter it. They may sabotage what they cannot fully control, because genuine relationships require something that a deeply defensive person may find frightening: the freedom of another human being. A healthy relationship cannot be completely managed. Your partner will have their own opinions, friendships, ambitions, boundaries, moods, and choices. They will sometimes disagree with you, need space, or make decisions you would not make. For a secure person, these differences can exist without destroying the bond. But for someone whose emotional stability depends heavily on control and external validation, another person's independence can feel threatening. At first, independence may even be attractive. A confident, self-directed person can appear fascinating because they seem strong and desirable. But as emotional attachment develops, that same independence may become uncomfortable. The person realizes, consciously or unconsciously, I cannot completely control this individual. That uncertainty can activate fear of rejection, abandonment, inadequacy, or losing importance. Instead of expressing that fear honestly, sabotage can emerge. They may provoke arguments, create jealousy, criticize the partner's friends, withdraw affection, make unreasonable demands, or suddenly become emotionally distant. Sometimes they may create a conflict immediately before an important moment of closeness. The relationship becomes unstable, and instability restores a strange sense of control because now the emotional focus is on managing the crisis rather than confronting vulnerability. There can also be a deeper psychological contradiction. They may desperately want reassurance while simultaneously rejecting the person who provides it. They may want closeness but become uncomfortable when someone gets too close. They may want loyalty but distrust anyone who has the freedom to leave. They may demand love while creating conditions that make love increasingly difficult. Eventually, the other person may become exhausted. They begin withdrawing emotionally, questioning themselves, or considering leaving. Ironically, the narcissistic person may then feel temporarily justified. See, people always abandon me. The original fear appears confirmed, even though their own behavior helped create the outcome. This is why sabotage can become a self-fulfilling cycle. Fear creates control, control creates tension, tension creates distance, distance creates abandonment, and abandonment reinforces the original fear. Understanding this pattern does not excuse destructive behavior. A person remains responsible for how they treat others. Real change begins when they can tolerate the uncertainty of another person's freedom without turning that freedom into a threat. What looks like power from the outside can sometimes be a desperate attempt to escape feelings that a person does not know how to tolerate internally. A narcissistic pattern can appear confident, dominant, fearless, and completely in control, yet beneath that exterior, there may be intense sensitivity to shame, rejection, criticism, inadequacy, or loss of status. The important distinction is that understanding this does not mean assuming every narcissistic person secretly feels the same way. People are psychologically complex, and destructive behavior can have different causes. When difficult emotions arise, a person with strong narcissistic defenses may struggle to remain with those feelings long enough to understand them. Instead of sitting with insecurity, they may seek admiration. Instead of acknowledging shame, they may blame someone else. Instead of tolerating rejection, they may reject the other person first. Instead of admitting fear, they may become controlling or aggressive. The external behavior changes the emotional situation, at least temporarily. For example, imagine someone receives criticism that touches a deep insecurity. Internally, they may experience humiliation or fear of being inadequate. Rather than saying, "That really affected me," they may attack the person who offered the criticism. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about their behavior. It becomes about how terrible, disrespectful, jealous, or ungrateful the other person supposedly is. The painful feeling has been pushed outward. This can create the appearance of strength because the person seems unwilling to accept blame or show weakness. But refusing to experience an emotion is not the same as mastering it. Emotional strength involves being able to feel discomfort without immediately acting destructively. The tragedy is that these defenses often produce the very consequences the person fears. Fear of rejection can lead to behavior that pushes people away. Fear of humiliation can create arrogance that damages relationships. Fear of losing control can produce controlling behavior that causes others to leave. The person may then interpret the outcome as proof that the world is against them rather than recognizing how their defenses contributed to it. Real psychological strength would require tolerating the feelings beneath the defenses: shame without collapse, rejection without revenge, insecurity without domination, and vulnerability without humiliation. Until that capacity develops, what looks like power may actually be an ongoing struggle to escape inner discomfort. Understanding the wounds behind narcissistic behavior is important, but understanding is not the same as excusing. A person may have experienced neglect, rejection, inconsistent affection, humiliation, or emotional insecurity, and those experiences may have contributed to defensive patterns. But having a painful history does not remove responsibility for what someone chooses to do with that pain. The turning point is accountability, because without it, psychological insight can become another way of avoiding responsibility. Accountability means being able to look at your behavior without immediately searching for someone else to blame. Instead of saying, "I treated you that way because you made me angry," the person begins asking, "Why did I respond with cruelty when I felt angry?" Instead of saying, "You forced me to control you," they recognize, "I became controlling because I could not tolerate uncertainty." That difference may seem small, but psychologically, it changes everything. Real change also requires tolerating shame without turning it into rage. This is particularly important because shame can be extremely uncomfortable. When someone is confronted with the consequences of their behavior, they may feel exposed or defective. A defensive response is to attack the person delivering the feedback, deny what happened, rewrite the event, or portray themselves as the victim. Accountability requires something harder: remaining present with the discomfort and accepting that harmful behavior occurred. It also requires behavioral consistency. Saying, "I am sorry," does not automatically repair repeated harm. Genuine change becomes visible through different choices over time. The person listens without immediately becoming defensive. They respect boundaries even when they dislike them. They stop using punishment and manipulation to regain control. They acknowledge mistakes without demanding immediate forgiveness. They understand that trust is rebuilt through repeated behavior rather than promises. This is why compassion alone cannot transform a destructive relationship. You can understand where someone's defenses came from, but you cannot do their emotional work for them. You cannot make them self-aware by explaining their childhood perfectly. You cannot force accountability through endless conversations. Ultimately, healing requires the person to recognize that their wounds may explain their defenses, but their defenses are still their responsibility. The past may explain how the pattern began, but meaningful change depends on what they choose to do with it now. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is that destruction is rarely the sign of true inner strength. Sometimes the person who appears most powerful is fighting hardest to escape what they cannot bear to feel within themselves. Fear becomes control, shame becomes blame. Insecurity becomes superiority, vulnerability becomes anger, and what began as a defense can eventually destroy the very relationships, opportunities, and connections the person desperately wanted to keep. But understanding this should never require you to excuse it. You can recognize someone's wounds without becoming responsible for healing them. You can understand their past without allowing their past to become your punishment. You can have compassion for the pain that shaped them while still holding them accountable for the pain they create. Because ultimately, healing does not come from finding another person to control. It comes from developing the courage to look inward, to tolerate uncomfortable emotions, to acknowledge mistakes, and to stop making other people carry what belongs inside oneself. And if you have been hurt by someone else's destructive behavior, remember this: their inability to protect a healthy connection is not proof that you were unworthy of love. Sometimes you were simply standing too close to a person who had never learned how to remain connected without defending themselves against intimacy. Your responsibility is not to save them from themselves. Your responsibility is to stop abandoning yourself in the process of trying. When you understand that, you stop asking why you could not love them enough to change them, and you begin asking what you need to do to protect your own peace, dignity, and emotional freedom.